HSBC is ordered to pay $1.9 billion after laundering money for what the U.S. Department of Justice termed drug kingpins and rogue nations. But is it enough? And Michigan, once a stronghold of the U.S. labor movement, passes right-to-work legislation limiting union power in the face of large-scale protests. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Helkett. The British bank HSBC advertises itself as the world's local bank, but it's had to pay a heavy fine for doing business with some rather dubious clients who used the bank to move billions of dollars around the financial system. U.S. prosecutors said the bank was guilty of, quote, a blatant failure to implement anti-money laundering controls and willfully flouted U.S. sanctions. Nearly $900 million in drug trafficking money was laundered through HSBC accounts in Mexico. A U.S. Senate investigation also found that the bank circumvented U.S. safeguards designed to block transactions involving terrorists, drug lords, and rogue states. It provided U.S. dollars and banking services to some banks in Saudi Arabia, despite their alleged links to terrorist financing. HSBC was also found to have regularly bypassed restrictions on dealing with Iran, North Korea, and other states subject to U.S. sanctions. Well, the bank's chief executive said he was profoundly sorry, and the penalty includes a 5-year agreement to install an independent monitor. But HSBC will not be criminally prosecuted. And the bank, which made pre-tax profits of $21.9 billion last year, saw its share price rise when the size of the fine was announced. Well, I spoke to Jeffrey Robinson, author of The Laundrymen, for his reaction to the fine.
I find that the decision by the Justice Department not to indict them for criminal money laundering and charge them with that is scandalous. I mean, this is not just some petty little incident. This is a huge conspiracy to bring Mexican drug cartel money through the U.S. financial system. That is a criminal act. And what's the sense of having the laws that we've got on the books about money laundering if you're not going to charge the bank and the bankers? It's beyond belief that the Justice Department would be such cowards.
Their concern, they say, is the fact that, there was fear there would be a destabilization of the global financial system. And so that's the reason for proceeding this way. I mean, isn't that a valid concern?
Baloney. Absolute baloney. No, it's not a valid concern. First of all, you're not bringing down the bank. You are charging the bank and various bankers with a criminal act, and they should be held accountable.
Now, you've been researching money laundering for a very long time and writing about it as well. Just how egregious is this case, comparatively speaking?
Well, consider the fact that money is the lifeblood of all businesses. If you're talking about General Motors, if you're talking about Microsoft, if you're talking about Apple, if you're talking about Al Jazeera, you're talking about cash flow and reinvestment. Crime is a business as well. And drug trafficking, for example, relies entirely on cash flow and reinvestment. What you've got in Mexico at the moment is a narco economy in the midst of what probably is a civil war. Now, if you allow the cartels to use the cash flow and reinvest, you simply increase the violence and the drug trafficking. What you have to do is you've got to cut off the cash flow, cut off the reinvestment, and like any business without it, you would bankrupt them. The fact that HSBC was dealing with these people, knowingly or unknowingly, it doesn't matter. The fact that they were dealing with these people and allowing these gangs to continue their business is a very egregious act and needs to be dealt with in the criminal courts.
And HSBC, though, has said, for its credit, has said that, that was then, this is now, it's a very different company now. We've put internal controls into place to make sure this doesn't happen again. I mean, isn't that demonstration, at least, that the company is trying to change its behavior?
Oh, sure. And when I rob your bank and they come and catch me, I'll say, you know what, guys, it was only one time. That was then, this is now. I won't rob any banks anymore. No, it doesn't work like that. The people who committed this crime need to be held accountable. And when you look at what the Justice Department has done, you have all sorts of questions. First of all, Did they have a grand jury? Did they pull a grand jury to indict them criminally and simply not announce that? If they did, why didn't they announce it? Why didn't they charge criminal charges? If they didn't convene a grand jury, why not? I mean, the idea of a deferred prosecution, which is what this is, they have said to the bank, okay, this is now, we will defer the prosecution of the criminal charges, and you have to be a good boy from now on. And we will fine you $1.9 billion. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, and to you and me, it probably is. To HSBC, where the value of the bank is $190 billion, that represents 1% of the market value of HSBC. That doesn't hurt. That does not hurt them. Now, if you're going to inflict pain to change behavior, this is not the way to do it.
But won't it be painful, the fact that it will be subject to further scrutiny and perhaps punitive action if it doesn't continue to comply with the conditions of this settlement?
Rob a bank and try and get away with that excuse. It does not work. They have committed a criminal act. What's more, in fining the bank this $1.9 billion, the markets themselves were expecting a much more serious reaction. And you can tell that because when it was announced in London this morning, HSBC shares ticked up just a little bit. They should have dived. They didn't. The market was expecting worse. They figured, whew, they certainly dodged this bullet and we'll stick with them in the share markets.
So are you saying that it's not likely to have any impact moving forward on HSBC?
None whatsoever. Because when you find these guys, look at what happened. You know, this is one of a series of things that have happened in the past few years. ING's been done, Standard Chartered's been done, Wachovia before it. When you find these guys, you don't change their behavior. The fine is simply the cost of doing business. What changes the banker's behavior is when you put him in an orange jumpsuit and you lock him in a 6x4 cell with a guy named Bruce who's got 2 fang tattoos on the side of his neck. That gets his attention.
Now to Michigan, where legislators have given final approval to 2 bills limiting union power. The so-called right-to-work measure means employees will no longer have to sign up to a trade union as a condition of employment. There have been large-scale protests against the move in the state's capital, Lansing. From where Al Jazeera's John Terrett sent this report.
It's a snowy, blustery day here in Lansing, Michigan, and thousands of people have turned up at the state capitol building to protest the right-to-work legislation, which they say is a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't offer anybody the right to a job or the right to work at all. What it does do is it ends the closed shop. Widely known in labor circles around the world, the closed shop is where an employee can't get a job unless he or she agrees to join a trade union or pay fees that are similar to union dues. Now, the union view is that if this legislation goes through, it will slowly choke them off financially and stop them being able to do the things that they do, such as collective bargaining and fighting for better workers' wages and conditions and safety issues, and of course, training. Now, the governor and the Republicans and business leaders here in Michigan say if the unions are so good, people will want to join them anyway. And what this is really about is making Michigan more competitive, not only with the 23 other U.S. states who have signed right-to-work legislation, but also with countries around the world. Remember, Michigan is the home of the big 3 U.S. automakers. We went into the crowd earlier to talk to people to find out what makes them so angry about the passing of the right-to-work legislation.
After this, you might not get holiday pay no more. You may not get vacation pay. All that can change. All the wages are going to drop. It's all about big business. It's not about the workers anymore.
I would really like to have the right to work because people in the United States are unemployed. 1 out of every 2 young people is unemployed. I would be really for the right to work if it actually meant the right to have a job. But it doesn't.
If there's not a union wage, there's no wage to compete against. So that means you could work for $7.50. Someone like you could work for $7.50 an hour. And I work for $7.50 an hour, and I'm a high school student, and I can barely buy my cleats for soccer, my gas money. So how could someone live in a house and support your family if you're working for $7.50?
We've met people who are here from right across the Rust Belt, from New York, from Ohio, from Michigan, of course, from Wisconsin, and from states all around the country where this or similar legislation has been passed. And they're all of the same view, and that is that if right to work passes here in Michigan, they will end up working for less pay with fewer benefits and in less safe conditions.
John Terrett reporting there. So is the influence of U.S. trade unions declining? To discuss this, I am joined in the studio by Bill Fletcher Jr., who is an author and activist and who has been a member of several unions. And from New York, Josh Eidelson is a labor journalist who contributes to The Nation and Salon. Bill, I want to start with you then. Is this a setback for unions and workers' rights?
Oh, it's definitely a setback. But it's sort of like the poison curare. It's been spreading through the body since the late 1940s when the Taft-Hartley Act introduced this provision. It is a misnomer. There is no right to work. It would be better described as right to be greedy, because really what this is that it says, in essence, that a worker does not need to pay dues or a fee, but can receive the benefits of collective bargaining. And what bothers me about this is that when you hear the hypocrisy of some of these Republicans, it would be as if in a city, in Washington, D.C., that you would say to people, you don't have to pay taxes. However, you get the benefit of a fire department, police department, transit system, water, and only if you want to pay taxes do you pay the taxes. Now, people would laugh this idea out of the country. Unions are obligated by law to represent all the workers in a particular place where they've been elected. They don't have a choice. They have to. Therefore, what these Republicans are doing is exactly what the person who was interviewed said. They're trying to strangle the unions.
And Josh, I want to bring you in here. As Bill pointed out, this is a predominantly Republican-led effort. I mean, the bottom line, the fact that dues cannot be collected automatically as a condition of employment really erodes the power of unions and gives them fewer resources. Isn't that right?
That's right. And we should be clear that under U.S. law, no one can be required to be a member of a union anywhere in the country. No one can be required to pay dues to a union. The question is simply whether workers who are represented by a union can be required, if the workers in the union choose to negotiate it into a contract as part of a union that has been voted in by workers in that shop, whether they can choose that everybody has to pay narrowly for the cost of that representation. And what we see here is a dark day for organized labor in the United States. In less than 2 years now, we've seen body blows in Wisconsin, arguably the birthplace of public sector unionism in the U.S. in the modern era, and now in Michigan, arguably the birthplace of the modern private sector U.S. labor movement. It shows the ascension of far-right anti-union forces within the Republican Party, and it also shows the tremendous political vulnerability of unions. As unionization has declined in the U.S., unions have become much more vulnerable, and it's been easier to stir up resentment against union benefits.
Well, let's talk about some of those benefits. I mean, here are a few statistics about right-to-work states. Now, we know that whether in a union or not, the average worker in a right-to-work state makes $1,500 less than workers in states without these laws. They're also much less likely to have health insurance provided by their employer or pensions. And right-to-work states also have the lowest rates of union membership. Across the United States, the rate of union membership was 11.8% in 2011. That is down from 35% in 1954. I mean, the bottom line is it seems that, generally speaking, workers reap fewer gains once their states become right-to-work states.
Oh, absolutely. And people have known that for years. This is no great revelation. It's not like the sky opened up and issued this. The reality is that consistently, the differential between right-to-work states and non-right-to-work states has been there for the public. But what's happened over years, the very notion of right to work has confused a lot of people. Many people have been mystified by that, and they actually thought that this would somehow improve their chances of getting employment. It simply does not.
But is that what the Republican legislators who have been spearheading this are thinking? I mean, why would they support something that's not beneficial for Michigan workers?
Because it's war. I mean, this is war. I mean, let's not play games here. This is war. This is an attempt to annihilate the organizations of workers. That's what these guys in Lansing are doing. They know that this is what they're doing. They see the unions as the obstacle to their economic agenda. And where you have strong unions, their agendas have been blunted, if not blocked. When you have weaker unions, as in these right-to-work states, then the agendas can move. So that's what this is about. This is not about increasing employment opportunities. It's not about investment, because everybody knows it doesn't make any difference. But what it does make a difference is that it weakens the organizations of workers.
But at the same time, and Josh, I want to ask you this. I mean, Michigan has been struggling economically. I mean, isn't there an argument to be made in all of this that in order in a global economy for a state like Michigan that has been struggling to become more globally competitive, it can't continue to provide the benefits that unions are demanding?
Look, in order to have a healthy economy, in order to have family-sustaining jobs in the United States, you need to have consumers that are able to go out and buy things. Michigan, famously, we had employers who, whether through good motivation or through force, came to talk about having workers be able to pay to buy the same cars that they were making. And so this road to a low-wage economy is not the only way that the United States could head in the future. This model of a race to the bottom, where now Indiana tries to become more like Mississippi, Mississippi tries to become more like a country like Bangladesh, where we saw this awful fire driven by Walmart, this U.S. company, which is pushing, again, this race to the bottom. And now Michigan tries to become more like Indiana. This is a losing game. And in fact, even when we see companies come back to the U.S. that have gone abroad, if they're coming back to the U.S., as they often are, because the labor standards have become so low, this is not a victory. And so we have a broken trade system that incentivizes both countries and individual states to push workers and squeeze workers lower and lower.
But at the same time, isn't some job or having the ability to attract an employer to a state like Michigan that has been having that kind of difficulty better, offering employment, isn't that better than no jobs at all?
Workers throughout U.S. history have rejected that idea. The idea that they should be grateful to have any kind of job, or the idea that these incredibly wealthy companies, companies that rake in billions of dollars in profits, that these companies should be looked at as saviors, that the workers should feel lucky to have any kind of job. It's not true. And if you look at the research, there's a reason that the states are less wealthy when they have right to work. The idea that attracting these individual companies to come across state lines in order to get the chance to exploit workers more will ultimately lead to a more prosperous state, it hasn't been borne out, and we have decades of experience with right to work to show that.
Now, how likely is it, Bill, that this is actually going to stick? I mean, is there the chance that this could be overturned in some way?
Oh, I think it could be overturned. I don't know whether something could be taken up in court, but I think that the fundamental thing is for the union members and their allies in Michigan to understand that in the next election, the people that move this need to be ousted. See, this is, again, the attempt on the part of the Republicans is to eliminate unions. We have to understand that this is not a time for compromise. This is not a bipartisan, let's shake hands and we'll come to some middle ground. There is no middle ground here because their objective is the elimination of unions. Therefore, in the next election, my hope is that there'll be a major mobilization in Michigan. There was in this last election in November, an attempt to move a constitutional amendment on the part of unions to institutionalize collective bargaining. It failed. And the failure of that, I believe, was sort of like blood in the water for the sharks in terms of trying to move this right to work legislation.
But at the same time, there is a trajectory that you've pointed out seems to be where the United States is headed. Let's take a look at that. I mean, when the Governor Snyder signs the legislation, Michigan will become the 24th right-to-work state in the United States. And when you take a look at that map there, you can see that there is a profound trajectory in terms of where this is going. This seems to be where the United States is headed. So I guess my question is it possible, Bill, to even turn this around?
Oh, it is definitely possible, but here's where the trick lies, that the union movement itself needs to retool. It needs to reframe its objectives. That to the extent to which regular people who happen not to be in unions think that this is only a matter of unions as an organization, we've lost. We could just surrender right now. To the extent to which regular workers see what's going on as a real increase in economic injustice that affects union members as well as non-union workers, we can win. And we see in a number of battles, for example, the battle of the Chicago teachers' strike just a few months ago, where what happened in advance, all the predictions were that the teachers were going to lose. All the predictions were that the teachers were going to run a strike that looked like it was special interest. And instead, under very inspired leadership, they ran a strike where the strike became a strike about the kids, about the families. See, that's the winning direction. We have the capability of doing that. The question is whether the union movement will.
Well, and that is the question I want to pose to you, Josh. I mean, many say this could be a symbolic turning point that is not going in favor of workers. The fact that Michigan, a state that has been traditionally pro-union, is the birthplace of one of the best-known unions in the United States. I mean, the fact that it was not able to stop this sort of sweeping legislation has to be a concern from a worker standpoint.
Sure, we've seen this year, last year, a series of reminders of the tremendous vulnerability, particularly in politics, of U.S. unions. At the same time, as Bill says, we've seen instructive victories. But we should not think of the decline in U.S. unionization simply as a matter politically of less union voters. The truth is, as unionization goes down, there are fewer people who have friends who are in unions, and there are fewer non-union workers who are benefiting from an effective union standard because companies don't have to worry as much about keeping their standards up to keep unions out. And so union members become more and more politically isolated. At the same time, as Bill said, the Chicago Teachers Union showed that when you are relentlessly democratic internally, when you spend years building partnerships that are deep and not just quid pro quo with members of the community and with the people that you're serving, you can win. And you can win in the face of a very hostile national media. We saw workers at the Port of Los Angeles in the past couple weeks go on strike where you had clerks on the one hand and longshore workers on the other who prevented billions of dollars of revenue from coming in, beat back many concessions. We see workers now mounting the most effective ever challenge in the United States to Walmart, the #1 antagonist of U.S. unions. And so where you have savvy organizing, where you have real relentless leadership development, when you have visionary unionism that is absolutely tied in to the community, to a larger social agenda, and most of all, when workers are pushed to push their coworkers and to treat a union and own a union as a social movement rather than a business that provides services, you can still win.
So Bill, do you think this is sort of, I mean, this sounds hopeful when you listen to Josh, but you know, many others who have commentated on this have said, no, this is the exact opposite of what's happening, that there's an erosion of the middle class, very little is going to trickle down, and this is really a loss for the ordinary worker, and it's really the billionaire business people who are going to gain ultimately.
Well, I think that both of you are right. I think that what Josh just pointed out is that there is one road we can go down and succeed. The road that we're currently on is a road to disaster. It's a road to disaster for the average worker. And unless we make a concerted effort to get off that road, then unions will become, like I like to say, like the 1950s film, The Incredible Shrinking Man. They won't die. They'll just shrink forever and ever. So we have that choice right now. I actually happen to be optimistic. And I happen to be optimistic because I see just what Josh was pointing out. There's something bubbling beneath the surface. But what we have to understand at the same time is that we don't have a lot of time to waste. What's being done in these state legislatures is setting a pattern that will be much more difficult to break over time. It's a national campaign that actually, we have to understand, began in the 1940s. It did not just begin a few years ago. It didn't just begin with the Koch brothers. It began in the 1940s with an effort to derail what was so important about the National Labor Relations Act. Now, here's my final point. maybe my final point, in the Depression, workers through unionization raised their living standard. In the Great Depression, at a point when you could make an argument that you should have weakened unions so that the economy would have improved. It was the improving of the unions, the building of the unions, that helped to improve the economy. That's the lesson that we have to understand today.
Bill Fletcher, Josh Eidelson, appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
And that is all from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Thanks for watching Inside Story Americas.